right, welcome everyone. This is the first installment of the St. Peter's E Church Adult Ed series on early and medieval Christianity. This is designed really just as a kind of adult education for a parish setting, but of course everyone is welcome to watch. Whoever finds this video wherever it's posted is certainly welcome to watch and offer their own critiques and comments.
Before we jump in, a quick word about where we are. So Steve and I are in the Children's Chapel at St. Peter's, and we're going to move around on different days to different locations throughout the church. So we are sitting in front of the Children's Dossal, and the Children's Dossal was lovingly, I guess it was not exactly cross-stitched, but definitely embroidered, yeah, by the women of the church, and it's actually drawings that were made by the children of the church during Sunday school. We're panning up so we can see it, and it's fantastic.
Give everyone a bit of a view there.
And we love it.
And then a member also built the case for it.
Yep.
It's in a sizable wooden case.
Beautiful.
So that'll serve as the backdrop for our first installment here.
Yep.
In some ways it's a very fitting backdrop too, because it's the biblical narrative. Here's Adam and Eve.
It's creation history, yeah.
Down here, sort of all the way up through the various stories in the Bible.
And then there's St. Peter's at the bottom.
Yeah, so it's sort of past, present, and future. And in some ways it's fitting for the birth of Christianity, the early church, because the early church actually first developed as a movement within Judaism. A group of followers of this rabbi, Jesus, had come to believe that rather than dying on the cross, he was resurrected. And that resurrection signified the redemption of Israel. It was fundamentally a turning point for their understanding of their own faith.
So what time period are we talking about? Are we talking about directly after the death of Jesus?
Exactly.
Okay.
So this is the period directly after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This group of followers, this core group of followers, come to believe that rather than dying, he's been raised from the dead. And as they read their scriptures, they see, well, maybe this makes sense. Maybe the fact that the Messiah died and was raised again all fits into this much larger arc of Scripture, the Scriptures as we've received them.
So when we're thinking about the church in this period, are we thinking predominantly about the Roman Empire?
This is going to be in the context of the Roman Empire. So this early group of, you could call them Christians, but they themselves, at the very earliest stages, would have thought of themselves as a movement within Judaism.
Yeah.
The context is the Roman Empire, and that's going to become very important. But one of the biggest questions that arises in the early church is, how exactly does this movement fit within Judaism? And things get even trickier as lots of Gentiles become attracted to this early Christian movement. Questions arise among the Jewish Christians, Jewish followers of Jesus. How exactly does this community integrate into the pre-existing Jewish tradition? Does this community, for example, need to be circumcised? Do the men need to be circumcised? Do they need to keep kosher? Do they need to follow other prescriptions of the ritual law as handed down through the generations? The answer to that question varied by camp, but one important voice here was the Apostle Paul.
Sure.
Paul, of course, called himself a Pharisee of Pharisees and viewed the early Christians in that immediate generation right after Jesus' death and resurrection as a threat to the Jewish tradition.
Paul, formerly known as Saul, aka Super Jew.
Exactly, a
Right.
Pharisee of Pharisees. The Pharisees were a movement within Judaism. And Paul actually famously held everyone's coat while they were stoning Stephen, the first martyr.
Is that hard for you, considering your namesake?
A little bit.
Gets emotional sometimes?
That's right, a little bit. Nevertheless, Paul himself undergoes this very dramatic conversion experience. He's on his way to Damascus, and he's going in order to hand over more names, right, to the synagogue authorities, names of people who are following this Jesus movement. And as he's going, he sees or hears the risen Christ.
He's blinded by.
And he's blinded, right? And famously, in all the artistic representations, he's knocked off of a horse.
You have to fall off a horse, I think, actually.
But there is no horse in the biblical account.
No, there isn't.
But nevertheless, he goes from a persecutor of the church to one of its leading advocates. And he goes from holding a very high standard of purity and a very high standard in terms of adhering to the ritual law to having a lot more openness in terms of Gentile converts.
So, okay, let's say I'm living in this time period, you and I are living in this time period, and Paul comes into our town, whether we're in Corinth or wherever.
Right.
What would the gathering look like? What kind of people would be there?
So
primarily Jews, primarily Gentiles?
I see what you're saying, yeah. So it's interesting. Paul's message in his letter is that he was sort of authorized to be the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
So in that case, Paul's audiences, if you follow just what he says in his letters, would have been primarily Gentiles. In the book of Acts, however, Paul consistently goes to Jewish synagogues first to preach and then to the Gentiles.
And so, women are there and present and accounted for in the narratives,
Absolutely. Ultimately, what Paul decides is that people don't get right with God on the basis of external signs such as circumcision following the works of the law, but rather this internal disposition.
Right.
So faith, for example, is what puts the individual or the person in the right relationship with God. He famously uses the example of Abraham. Abraham believed God when God told him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. So for Paul, that was a way of saying that it didn't matter whether somebody was circumcised or not. What mattered was whether or not they had faith.
But one of the things I love as a priest and pastor about this early period and these early readings and the Pauline sort of early church experience is that you can watch the community grapple and fight the way we still do today.
Oh, yeah.
Over what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, who's in, who's out. We like X, we hate Y.
Right.
You can do this, but you're not allowed to do this. I'm a better follower of Jesus than you are because I was baptized by whoever.
Exactly. And it seems as though Paul is attempting to cut through a lot of that by distilling the movement down to its most sort of fundamental essence, which for him seems to be faith. Right. That, of course, could also just be my later Lutheran interpretation of Paul.
I was about to say, I think I see Lutheranism in the field.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it does seem that for Paul, his own Judaism remains very important. He considers himself a Jew. I don't think he thought of himself as forming a new religion, but rather following this movement within his own religious tradition based on his understanding of what had happened in Jesus.
I love in all the Pauline epistles and in the other literature from the period how the church just keeps falling apart after Paul leaves. Or like, oh, we were doing really well, and then we all decided to worship Apollo for a while, upsie-daisies, and then they have to sort of be brought back into orthodoxy, proto-orthodoxy, which I think is so fascinating because you're dealing with a time period where really anything goes.
Exactly.
And so much is carried on through oral tradition, or what I heard from Crispus, or what I heard from so-and-so, who knew Peter one time. They were fishing buddies, so this is how we're leading this church community.
Yeah, and I think what you really see is this attempt to consolidate authority at this point, and people sort of wonder, well, who do we follow? Who do we listen to?
Which is really sort of that whole beginning of the diaconate, that birth of orders.
Yeah.
Was who do we follow and why do we follow them, and who is ordained to lead.
Right, you have various words that Paul is using to describe leaders, like the presbytery. You have elders, you have bishops, the episcopoi. There is a sense that there are certain authorized offices in the church developing at this sort of
And people are expressing a need for leadership that represents them and their own life experience. So like Gentiles want Gentile leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, what's interesting though
There's
is
also regionality to that.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting here is this movement, this early Christian movement, this sort of Christian Jewish movement, is becoming more and more distinct from mainline Orthodox Judaism. The reason for that, in large part, is because this Christian movement does sort of denigrate certain aspects of the law. There's some evidence that would suggest that Jewish followers of this Christian movement still followed all of the aspects of the law, but nevertheless, there's this kind of opening divide between the two groups.
Yeah, I always think of the sheet with all the abominable foods.
Exactly. Peter has this vision in the book of Acts where there's a sheet coming down with all kinds of non-kosher food, and God says to Peter to go ahead and eat. And Peter says, "Nothing unclean has ever touched my lips, but nevertheless, that which the Lord makes holy is holy indeed." The sense being that the food is holy, and also the Gentiles are holy because they've been made holy by God. So you have this development of a Gentile church, and as more Gentiles come into the church, and as they're allowed to continue really living and acting and eating like Gentiles, a greater divide develops. And really, the divide becomes even more pronounced around the year 70 CE, because it was shortly before that the Jewish revolt began against the Roman Empire. And it was put down very harshly by the Romans.
Those are the,
He was, I forget which one he was a general in, and then he kind of became, more sympathetic to the Romans. I forget exactly which one. But yeah, what happens is the temple is destroyed. The Romans come into Jerusalem and destroy the temple after the siege of Jerusalem, and famously the Arch of Titus in Rome still has the relief depicting the Romans taking the menorah out of the temple. If you were a pious Jew at this time, that would have been absolutely one of the most religiously traumatic events that could happen.
And spiritual warfare.
Exactly. It would be the equivalent today of maybe the Vatican being destroyed for Roman Catholics.
Sure.
Imagine your sort of place where you met God, where God and humanity meet, heaven and earth meet at this point in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden that is completely destroyed. So what happens is the Jewish leaders have to decide what this means for their faith. And they begin that conversation. And Christians begin to interpret the destruction of the temple as this symbol of Jesus sort of replacing the old sacrificial order. So in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, throughout the Gospels, you have references to the temple being destroyed and Jesus rebuilding the temple in himself. So Christians and Jews are going to deal with the destruction of the temple in very different ways. And as they come to different answers for how we meet God, you see a real divide between Christianity and Judaism develop. It becomes much clearer. You also have a lot more antipathy toward Jews from Christian writers. In the Gospel of Matthew, there are some very unfavorable presentations of the Jewish people.
Oh yeah, there's a fair amount of anti-Semitism.
Right. Well, anti-Judaism, it's not a racial component, because anti-Semitism sort of implies a sort of anti-racial motivation. There's an anti-Jewish, though, certainly anti-Jewish reading. Exactly. So in the early days, when you read these anti-Jewish statements, it really is the voice of a group of people attempting to define themselves over and against a group of people with whom they share many beliefs. It becomes disastrous, though, as you're pointing out, in the later centuries when Christians gain political dominance over Jewish minorities. These texts were then used as very abusive texts and inspired violence towards these Jewish minority communities in Europe and other places.
Worldwide.
Yeah. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But at this early time period, what we really see is this division between the church and the synagogue. The next important event, though, in some ways more traumatic even than the destruction of the temple, or having at least further consequences, was the result of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 CE. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish people were technically not legally allowed to enter Jerusalem anymore. So in some sense, you have this vast dispersion or diaspora of Jewish communities throughout the world. And Judaism really then has to grapple with this question of who are we, what do we believe in? And the rabbis come to this answer, well, we can't make sacrificial acts in the temple anymore, but we can make sacrificial acts of loving kindness. So the life of a Jewish person then becomes this movement toward justice and sacrificial giving, that kind of thing. It also becomes a life of study, specifically studying the Talmud, which is comprised of two parts, Mishnah and Gemara. Mishnah is a whole bunch of rabbinical commentaries on every aspect of Jewish life, and Gemara is an additional layer of commentary on the Mishnah. So Jewish life, Jewish religious life, becomes on the one hand acts of loving kindness, and on the other hand acts of study. Reading these commentaries, debating with your peers about the meaning of these commentaries. And the Talmud becomes a kind of, they call it the oral Torah, the oral law. So it stands on the same level in some traditions as the Torah itself, as being God's revealed word to the Jewish people. Christians, on the other hand, are going to view Jesus as bringing people back into unity with God. The way to God for Christians becomes Jesus. And so by the end of the first century, certainly by the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, you have two very clear movements. There had been sort of a full parting of the ways between Jews and Christians.
Less one.
Right, exactly. Although you still did have lots of instances of people belonging both to churches and synagogues. I think even Jerome writes about some communities where there was still dual relationships going on. And certainly early Christian communities benefited from their relationship to Judaism because Judaism was legal in the Roman Empire. And I'll talk more about that in just a second.
Are we going to talk about Rome?
Yeah, it's time to sort of talk about Rome. So we've talked. The first thing we talked about here is that Christians and Jews kind of go through this parting of the ways.
Yeah.
Christianity begins as this really a kind of marginal Jewish sect, and it now is sort of out in the wider world.
It's its own thing.
Its own thing. It has a cosmopolitan outlook. Judaism is a religion for the Jewish people, whereas Christianity claims to be for all people.
Everybody?
Everybody.
Everybody?
It's interesting. I've often found when we were living in New York, people would ask us on the street, "Are you Jewish?"
Are you Jewish, my friend?
Exactly. And if you would say no, then the conversation would stop, whereas if you would say yes, then the conversation would keep going, because they were interested in you only if you were a part of this larger, you could say, sort of socio-ethnic community.
Sure.
On the other hand, if a Christian missionary would come up to you and ask, "Are you Christian?" They'd only be interested in talking to you if you said no.
Right.
So if you said yes, they'd leave you alone. If you said no, that's when they'd be interested in talking to you, because they are only interested in people on the outside. So that sort of highlights the difference between the two outlooks in terms of membership, who's in, who's out, who we want to be a member of our community, who should be a member of our community. But Rome, let's talk about the Roman situation, because a few things are important about the Greco-Roman world. First and foremost, Christianity is able to spread throughout the Greco-Roman world in no small measure because of Pax Romana. The Roman military was I guess arguably the most advanced military in the world at the time. It had basically subdued all of the various tribes that could cause trouble. Yep. It had very sophisticated roads.
Yep, there was transportation.
Exactly.
There were aqueducts.
Aqueducts.
Infrastructure.
Exactly, very advanced sea routes. People were able to travel throughout the empire in relative safety.
Right.
Which, when you think about it,
is a huge deal.
Is huge. In our contemporary world, we travel in relative safety because we have automobiles and various other infrastructure.
We don't worry about a warring horde attacking us on the way to Germantown.
Or highwaymen or things like that. Those things are much less common.
Warring horde.
In the ancient world, those things were fairly common occurrences.
Vikings.
Less so, though, where you had a very strong Roman army. So, transportation.
Yep.
Very easy, relatively safe.
Tell me about state religion in Rome.
Before we hit state religion in Rome, though, there's one other thing about the sort of cosmopolitan Roman Empire. They were all speaking Greek, Koine Greek.
It's Greek to me.
It's all Greek to me, too. But I'm told they were all speaking a very kind of, not simplified, but it's not kind of the classical Homeric. The Greek of Homer. It's not the Greek of Homer, but a much more sort of user-friendly type of Greek. It was a lot of people's second or even third language. But like English today throughout the world, it allowed people to communicate and pass ideas around.
Lingua franca.
Exactly. It was the lingua franca of the day. And Paul was able to write all of his letters, and the gospel writers were all able to use this language of Koine Greek in order to widely broadcast their message and have it understood in multiple contexts.
There you go.
So transportation on the one hand and communication on the other were both very easy, relatively easy.
Well, for the
in
period.
The Roman Empire. Exactly.
Very easy.
Most advanced in the world, you could say. So that's why the ideas spread around. In terms of the religious climate of the Greco-Roman Empire, here you get into this whole scholarly debate about what it actually looked like. And so it's somewhat complicated because a lot of times people will want to paint sort of a caricature of Greco-Roman religion.
Well, and Greco-Roman religion changed over time. It looks very different in different periods.
Exactly, and it had many different aspects, and it was very diverse.
But it looked very little like Disney's Hercules.
I don't know. I mean, maybe a little bit.
But I think the important thing to remember about Greco-Roman religion is that what?
So you have
that the emperor is God.
Well, that the emperor is worshipped as sort of quasi-divine.
Yeah, Hail Caesar.
The genius of the emperor is divine.
Yeah.
So one of the major differences.
It's going to be a sticking point.
Right. One of the major differences between the Greco-Roman world and our own is that for them, religion was not compartmentalized.
No, there was no division between state and...
Exactly. Religion and politics were completely united.
Yeah.
So to be a good Roman was to worship the emperor, in a sense, the genius of the emperor, the sort of spiritual...
And to give all your appointed sacrifices and to be a good citizen.
Exactly, and that becomes the sticking point. Roman citizens had to offer a sacrifice to the emperor, the genius of the emperor. Naturally, monotheists, like Jews and Christians, would have been opposed to offering sacrifices to anyone other than God.
Right.
The Jewish people had a dispensation from the Roman Empire.
It was an interesting relationship that Judaism had with the Roman Empire. It was almost as if Rome was like, oh, you're so old and you have books and all this learning. I guess you're fine.
See, one of the stereotypes that we have of Romans is that they were all just sort of decadent, a religious folk. They actually really appreciated ethics,
Yep.
and they really appreciated virtue, and they really appreciated things that had
And the study of the written
aura
word.
of antiquity about them. Exactly. And the Jews had this very ancient religion.
Mhm.
They had the aura of antiquity. They had very intellectual leaders.
Mhm.
So they were very much respected.
The
by
Romans were
the
like, that
Romans.
sounds great. We don't want to do it, but you go ahead.
Christians, on the other hand, especially in the
It's-
first generations,
It's new, it's ugly, they might be cannibals, and it's for slaves.
exactly, lower class people, women, people who are generally not viewed as the higher ups in society
Yeah.
tended to be Christian.
Non-citizens.
Exactly, and it all seemed a little unbelievable
Right.
to
Well,
your
it's a
standard
little made
Roman.
up sounding, right?
It was. So Christians found themselves on the outside of that system. It was not a legal religion, especially as the centuries marched on. You had less and less, well, how should I put it? Christians could find themselves in situations where their not totally licit religion could get them in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll talk
They
more
were
about
illegal.
that in a moment when we get to the whole question of persecution.
Diocletian.
So you have state religion going on. That's an important component of Greco-Roman religion. You also, of course, have this historic sort of pantheon
Mhm.
of deities who are
Yep.
related to various physical or natural phenomena,
Yep.
right? Like the goddess of the hearth
Hestia.
and the god of music, Apollo. Right? Zeus, of course, the king of the gods, thunderbolts, and of course, you also have the various names for gods that some are Greek, some are Roman, but they attempted to sort of all fit them into the same pantheon. The Jupiter, the Roman Jupiter, is the same as the Greek Zeus. Nevertheless, you have all of these different gods who are taking care of various physical functions.
Sure.
So when things are going wrong, like if you're having a huge hurricane, for example, you might go to the temple of Poseidon to make a sacrifice to Poseidon.
Or Neptune.
Oracles were
Yes.
big, slaughtering animals and bathing in their blood in order to learn about the future,
Reading their
entrails.
entrails.
Absolutely.
You don't necessarily
Jinx.
have to bathe in their blood.
Right. I might actually just be getting that from the HBO series Rome.
I was about to say, how much of your Roman history is informed by your HBO watching?
A lot.
70, 80%?
At least.
Excellent.
At least.
Excellent.
And the rest is from the Disney's Hercules.
I know, I'm sorry to attack you so personally that way, in front of all these people.
So yeah, absolutely. You have this kind of pantheon of deities, but you also have a more intellectual reading of these Roman myths as well. Neoplatonism was very popular. It espoused this kind of monotheism based on the concept of the one, the monad from which we
Sure.
all sort of, from which all life springs. Yeah, that you have at first. The first level
Yeah,
is the monad,
monad.
and the next sort of emanation of the divine is then there's
Two
the dyad,
monads.
and then eventually things just kind of emanate
Dyad.
down in lesser degrees
Degrees.
of perfection.
Correct.
So the movement of the planets
Yes.
would be sort of a higher degree
Yes,
of
they're
perfection.
perfect in their spheres
than
and their
the-
courses.
Exactly, than
Yeah.
the movement of the seasons.
Right.
Because things are born and die within seasons. The life cycle then would be slightly less perfect than that. The life cycle of snails would be less perfect than the life cycle of a human because a human can use intellect, right? And so you have this hierarchy all the way down to rocks, I guess. The sort of the inert things that don't move themselves.
Yes.
So you again have this kind of philosophical worldview, and that's going to be very important for early Christians, especially some of these early Christian apologists like Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, and Origen or Origen, depending on your pronunciation.
Origin.
If you're in Britain, he's Oregon.
Are we in Britain?
No, so we'll say Origin for the context of
Thank
this
you.
lecture, which is going very well, by the way.
We are very talented. I'm sure you all are enthralled.
So let's see. You again have this very philosophical type religiosity,
Sure.
and then you also have mystery religions.
Ooh, it's a mystery.
Exactly. These
Cultic
were
religion.
secretive groups that had a kind of esoteric knowledge, secretive rituals.
Gnosis.
And that's going to be very important when we talk about the Gnostics.
Yep.
So Christians sort of are finding themselves in a world where they're just sort of dividing from Judaism, attempting to claim to be the heirs of this scriptural tradition of Judaism on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're facing a lot of these very sophisticated Greco-Roman religions, or sort of so-called pagan religions. So they're going to have to attempt to define their own cultural life, or religious life, between these two groups of Romans on the one hand and Jews on the other.
And without the protection of either group.
Exactly. So given this fact that you have this very sort of strange group of people caught between these two religious worlds, how is it that they spread?
Funny, you should ask.
Funny, I should ask.
You're going to tell us.
Yes, I'm going to answer this question now, using the work of Rodney Stark. Rodney Stark is actually not a historian.
I preached on Rodney Stark last week.
That's right. Rodney Stark was actually a statistician.
Yes.
So he was studying things like mean, median, and mode before he began to ask questions about religious history. And he offers 5 reasons for why Christians might have been so successful in
Professor,
spread.
tell us all 5.
I will. We're going to dive right in. Reason number 1. His first argument is that Christianity spreads along social networks. He talks about families becoming Christian. Parents would convert their children, and sometimes vice versa. Wives frequently converted husbands, and less frequently, husbands would convert wives.
It's always the ladies.
Well, Christianity has always been more of a women's religion than a men's religion.
Thank you. Can you say that again?
Christianity has always been more of a women's religion than a men's religion.
Thank you, my love.
And I just actually read, we were talking about women Catholic missionaries.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in religious orders, women outnumber men something like 2 to 1.
Sure, of course they do.
So ultimately, you have Christianity spreading along trade networks. Business partners would talk about it. Friends were invited into this community. And why would people want to be part of this community? Well, Christians had this sort of very intimate social life gathered around the Eucharist. They ostensibly shared a kind of mutual love for one another that was a very attractive quality for people. Even though the Roman Empire was very sophisticated, life was incredibly vulnerable. You would have plagues, right? I think now, in the midst of this pandemic, we see just how vulnerable human populations can be to mass sickness.
Well, and we're reminded again in a very sort of heartbreaking and tangible way how important Christian community is when we're all in different places.
Right.
There is that longing to be together that is at the core of our faith system.
Right. Bear one another's burdens. People would sit down and talk to each other about their problems, and pray with each other, and hope that things would turn out well. That's a very powerful quality.
It is.
Galenus, the famous physician, who himself had very, mixed reviews of the Christians, certainly not like an advocate of Christianity, said that they are not in a condition to philosophize, but they live like philosophers. So, in other words, they're not in a condition to philosophize, right? These are not like the most intellectually savvy people. They're not wealthy. Not wealthy, not coming from the highest level of society. They're not sort of well-born Roman men, but rather they live like philosophers, meaning they have this kind of ethical and virtuous life. And again, Romans, especially high-class Romans, really appreciated virtue as a quality in people's lives. Again, Christians cared for one another, and that became very attractive to people.
What number are you on?
This is 1.
We're still on 1?
We're still on. Christianity spreads through social networks, but it feeds into 2.
All right, what is 2?
2 is care for widows, the orphans, and the sick. Lucian, another Roman who had very little regard for Christians.
Seems to be theme.
Right? Well, see, I do that because I say, like, this isn't an insider's voice.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Right? This is an outsider's voice.
They're far more accurate.
Well, and you can sort of...
It's more honest.
Exactly. You can trust him to be honest about it.
Yep.
Lucian writes, "It's marvelous how these men rush to one another in misfortune." Naturally, this is related to ideas of biblical prophecy, the idea that you care for the vulnerable, but they really wanted to care for the vulnerable members of their community. This is really where you get the diaconate, right? Sort of built into the early DNA of the church is that there's a separate office of people who are designed to care for the poor, people who are designed to care for widows, people who are designed to care for orphans.
Immigrants,
Exactly.
aliens.
Exactly. And this is where Stark makes his very famous point that we've talked about a lot, that I actually saw referenced in the New York Times a couple days ago.
They must have seen my sermon.
That's right. That when plagues would arise in the ancient world, high-class physicians like Galen would actually flee.
Let us go to our country home.
Exactly. They'd go to their well-stocked country villas and just kind of hang out until the plague died down.
I mean, it sounds good.
Interestingly, the Christians, and in particular deacons, would stay and nurse people back to health.
Tend the sick.
And even without modern medicine, caring for a sick person actually would increase their chance of recovery, which could appear miraculous for some, but also for others, you would want to join the community that actually saved you, out of this kind of innate human gratitude.
Works for me.
Right? You would say, you took care of me, now I want to sort of pay that forward by becoming part of this community and helping others to get well. This article I was reading, it's worth mentioning, was talking about the fact that in the early ages when people were going to the sick, that's because there were no doctors. Right? The Christians were sort of filling in this need. Today, however, in some ways, we can help most with our absence, right? By communicating with each other via technology that we now have, checking in on people.
But it's hard.
It's very hard.
Because it's at the core of our belief system to be there with people at the times of greatest distress.
Right,
So
right.
I struggle.
So we need to figure out how to be there with distance. But nevertheless, I'm so amazed all the time when people put up these sort of prayer services on Facebook and things like that. Just how many people watch those and just how many people comment and just how in an imperfect way, because they're not face to face in the same space, there is this kind of human contact.
And people want community.
Yeah, so I think it's nice to see that community arising in the midst of this kind of enforced absence of community.
Absolutely. I liked it, someone said the other day, it shouldn't be social distancing, it should be physical distancing.
Right, exactly. So we need to learn how to care for people over these.
What number are you
numbers.
on?
This is 2.
Still?
So 1, I'll just repeat. So we'll go through the list again. 1, Christianity spreads along social networks.
Got it.
2, Christians care for widows, orphans, and the sick. 3, Stark suggests, I'm not sure how true this is, but Stark suggests that Christians had larger families.
Oh.
Again, I'm not actually sure how true this is, but they tended to eschew contraceptive measures like abortion and infanticide.
Seems
and
good.
that second, or that infanticide actually is one of the major differences between the Roman world and our world today.
Oh, did they kill fewer female children? The Christians.
Yes, exactly.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Exactly. So in the ancient world, it was the prerogative of the father of the family.
The pater familias.
Exactly, the pater familias.
You knew I was going to say that.
To decide whether or not to accept a newborn child into his home or not. And if he would say that he didn't accept the child, then it would be left exposed, just sort of left out to the elements.
Or hopefully to a kindly shepherd.
Well, but so many of these stories with the kindly
shepherd.
So many of these stories are the kindly shepherd happens upon the foundling.
Exactly.
Right? So they're just kind of left to the elements or to the
or to be raised by wolves.
Exactly. That would happen too. But one of the things that happened, and early Christians talked about this, they would actually go around and if they found these babies who had been exposed, they would bring them in
Yeah.
and take care of them and raise them. And oftentimes, frequently, girl children were exposed at a higher rate.
Female, yeah.
And so Stark then goes on to say, well, these Christian girls then, these girls come into Christian communities, grow up as Christians, and then become Christian mothers, right? Thereby continuing the sort of social network spread of Christianity. Let's see here.
Phew, I was afraid we were going to miss a point there for a minute.
And that actually kind of flows into the next point, and that's Christians had more regard for women.
Oh, yeah.
Now, did they espouse a kind of gender equality that we believe in
false.
now? No. But according to the ancient world, there were definite double standards in terms of adultery, right? Women were expected to have sex with their husbands, while men, part of like the virility of a Roman man was to have sex with multiple people. Christians would hold men and women to the same standard in terms of adultery. Another thing is Christian churches allowed for women to hold leadership roles. A lot of women were deacons, a lot of women led prayers, and wealthier Christian women frequently hosted communities.
They were lady patronesses?
They were lady patronesses, exactly. You'll have to remember there was no separate church space at this time when churches were illegal, in essence.
Yeah.
Or not totally legal, I guess we could say, right? Because
it's pretty illegal.
Right, exactly. I think what happens is you have people saying, well, it's not necessarily written out that it's illegal to have this space, but it's definitely not written out that it's okay. People met in dining rooms of wealthier households because wealthier people tended to have a bit of a bigger dining room, and wealthier Christian women would frequently host churches in their dining rooms. And the Eucharist was in large measure, of course, set apart as a special ritual, but continued into this meal. A lot of scholars think this agape meal. Excellent. Christian women also are able to have a role beyond that of wife and mother. So a lot of the young Christian women would choose to remain unmarried and dedicate themselves to a life of service.
So you could
or
be a wife, you could be a mother, you could be a nun, you could be a martyr. Lots of great
However, it does create a space beyond the direct control of a husband or a father.
Sphere.
Exactly. More it does. More so it does. It created another option.
So many choices.
That's right.
I love it.
All right. So in a lot of ways, it's fascinating that when we talk about the history of Christianity, we're always talking about, Paul and Justin Martyr and Tertullian and Origen and you sort of have the list of men all the way to Schleiermacher and Karl Barth and Paul Tillich.
The great white men.
Exactly.
Thinkers.
You kind of just go through this male trajectory. However, you have this whole reality in which women are the ones who are primarily members of these churches, and women are the ones who are primarily the ones converting people.
Yep.
Right? And that's a fascinating reality, right?
Yeah.
That the history of Christianity is impossible without women. But
converting people, teaching the children, making all the bread.
Exactly, but their role is completely overlooked.
Why? Tell us.
Well, because the men were in charge.
And they wrote everything down.
And they were the ones who wrote everything down, that's right. Finally, we have this idea of martyrdom.
Is this your fifth point?
Yes.
Excellent.
We've made it to the fifth point.
I'm so glad. I thought
I love
might
Stark's
die in the
5
wilderness.
points.
I know you love lists.
I do, and I love lists,
I know.
that's true. Absolutely. So we're at the fifth point.
Martyrdom?
Martyrdom.
Everybody's favorite point.
Now, martyrdom should not be a statistical advantage.
It totally should be.
Why?
Because it's so inspiring.
Exactly. Again, Christianity, it's a sort of minority religion.
Right.
A lot of rumors spread about Christians. I think you had mentioned.
Some of them are true.
I think you had mentioned earlier they talked about
Cannibalism.
So Christians would talk about eating the body of Christ. That sounds like cannibalism.
Disgusting.
They would talk about brotherly love. That sounds like incest. They would talk about, well, they would often be baptized nude. So
Don't get any ideas.
rumors began
We're
to
not starting
spread.
that at St. Peter's. There's no nude baptism.
Rumors began to spread that these people were having these incestual cannibalistic orgies.
Sure.
Oftentimes in the catacombs where they were sort of celebrating their martyrs.
Yeah.
So
Well, and they let anybody join. They let ladies join, slaves can join.
exactly, and you didn't know what they were
Well, and
doing.
they all mix together in the same room in the same house.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right.
That's right. It just seemed wrong.
It's unseemly.
That's right. So a lot of these rumors spread, and in some ways, I mean, it's not all that different than the way minorities are stereotyped
Sure.
and rumors are thrown at minorities today.
That's human
Right.
nature. We like to
Absolutely.
do
So you have this minority group, lots of rumors spreading about them.
that. Maybe they eat
and
babies. I heard they did.
sometimes, well, that actually was where we get this piece of evidence that Christians would collect exposed children.
Yeah.
Somebody said, you claim that we eat babies, however, we're actually the ones who are
Raising the
these
babies
babies
you throw
that you're
out,
throwing
yeah.
out. Yeah. So kind of fascinating.
Martyrdom.
Martyrdom. So you have all these rumors flying around that if
So
there's
why
a
would
problem
someone
with
want
the
to be a martyr?
Christians- Well, we're getting there. We're getting there. But
No, I like
there's-
that part.
If there's a problem with society, it's probably these degenerate groups like the Christians.
It most
So if something goes
definitely
wrong,
is.
the Christians to the lions.
Yes.
I think it was Tertullian.
Yes.
I'll have to
Christians
double check
lions.
that, but he says, if the no, it wasn't
If the crop,
Tertullian.
if there's no rain in the fields, if there's an invading horde,
That's right.
anything.
I think it might have even been Origin. I forget who
Which
it was.
one?
It would have been an Egyptian though,
What is
because I
the
think
quote?
if the Nile is
Oh,
running
yeah.
low, the Christians to the lions. If the Nile floods, the Christians to the lions. Right?
yeah.
Anytime something goes wrong in society,
That would be.
it's the Christians to the lions.
I think it's Origin.
Origin, Clement, I'm not
Oh,
sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, I have it in a book somewhere.
I'm sure.
But
We
ultimately,
will post it below in the
ultimately, when you have this vulnerable group, this group that has all these stereotypes about them, when things go wrong, they could be
comments.
persecuted.
Scapegoated.
And that's what happened with the situation of martyrdom. And you have a few famous examples of martyrdom. Ultimately, though, these periods of martyrdom tended to be isolated. Sometimes they were widespread throughout the empire, but other times they were localized. And what happens...
Sometimes it was good for a season, and then you would have a new government system, and
Exactly. One of the biggest problems was Christians didn't sacrifice to the emperor, and so if there were a whole bunch of military defeats, people might think, oh, maybe it's the fact that these Christians aren't sacrificing to the
maybe it
emperor.
definitely is.
Right? And then you have these massive persecutions.
Right.
But what would happen is Christians would willingly die, and they would die very bravely. Not all, but
A
some.
lot.
Some would die very bravely, and the stories of their bravery was widely publicized.
Yep.
So in a world where life and death are around you all the time, where things are very frightening,
Yep.
when you have somebody who isn't afraid to die, well, that's pretty inspiring.
And or disturbing.
Well, and or disturbing, but it also says to the wider public, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe
And
I should look into
If it's
it.
worth dying for, it must be this hugely transformative, transcendent, godly experience.
Mm-hmm.
But the martyrologies, the martyr accounts from the period are, some of them are inspiring, some of them are disturbing,
Mm-hmm.
some of them are graphic,
Very much so.
but they definitely became part of the essential identity of the early church.
Right. Absolutely.
Who are our martyrs, and how do we remember them? And
Well, and then you asked the question earlier, why would someone want to be a martyr?
oh yeah, people wanted to be martyred,
Right.
so you go to heaven,
Yeah,
so you're famous. It's something you could do for your people and your cause and your
Exactly.
God.
exactly. It was Tertullian who did say, though, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. In other words, that
It's a happy thought.
well, no. In other words, where these people die, you have this
It's
kind
inspiring.
of massive inspiration of, well, maybe there's something to it. Yeah, I think of the phrase, don't turn him into a martyr,
Yeah.
right? People who are not treated too harshly by an oppressive regime, for example, because they don't want that person to become a martyr. Right? Like Nelson Mandela not being executed by the South African government was an example.
Or when I
that.
tell you, don't be a martyr.
Exactly.
Or if I say, get off the cross, we need the wood.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I would ever say that to you.
They all sort of fit in there. Let's see here.
I mean, the big martyr accounts I think of are, of course, Polycarp and Perpetua.
Right.
And Felicity.
Mm-hmm. Definitely read the account of Perpetua and Felicity.
Yeah.
Because that's widely available, first of all, online.
It's a fun, light reading. I don't like it. He likes it. I don't like it.
Well, what's fascinating, it also shows you some of the way that Christianity could turn gender hierarchies on their head.
Right, because they're female martyrs.
Mm-hmm. And her father comes to her, and her father traditionally would have been the one who had the power of life and death over his daughter to some extent.
But she's picking her own death.
But she's picking her own, and her father is sort of begging at her feet, crying.
Look at your baby! Don't, it's awful.
Asking her to spare her life, or to,
I don't like it.
Fair enough.
I'm grumpy though.
A lot of people were famously martyred. A lot of women were martyred for refusing to have sex with their husbands. That was another thing that happened. A lot of soldiers were martyred for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor. So again, lots of famous martyrs develop. And the martyrs become sort of the heroes of the church. And here you get the early idea of saints.
Sure.
People would go into the catacombs, famously in Rome, to martyr tombs, just to be near the bones of a martyr.
Or to collect relics that then you would take to a shrine. And
these objects of power.
This is the leg bone of Stephen or whoever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you have to imagine that these are people who, not only do they develop this sort of hagiography, this saintly following after death, but these are people they knew. Like, these are communities where you would know somebody who'd been martyred. Like, they would have a personal connection in your tiny church to someone who actually had died for their faith.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't really imagine how powerful that would be.
Right.
All joking aside, because, martyrdom is a lot.
Absolutely.
And martyrdom happens in contemporary settings.
Oh, yeah.
I spent some time in El Salvador and visited all the places, where there were different martyrs.
Yeah, like
the Marinol sisters and Oscar Romero, and you definitely get a sense of martyrdom happening within our lifetimes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In various traditions.
Well, and the reverence and the inspiration, and people do point to that as a converting moment in their lives. You have an entire orders of nuns that tend to these shrines and these tombs and these relics, and they feel called by God to carry on this message of specifically martyrdom, as a converting element, and to tell this story to people who have not experienced Christianity, to visitors, to newcomers to the faith.
Absolutely. I think about you talked about, they have Oscar Romero's vestments that he was wearing when he was murdered.
All covered in blood, and I mean that's very a part of the experience. They keep everything that is the physical parts of the deceased, which is a lot.
Absolutely.
But incredibly powerful. I mean, definitely in the top 10 experiences of my life. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, in some ways, that just goes to show you
how powerful it is.
How powerful it is that people are willing to
die for their people, to die for their God, to die for their cause.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's see.
That might be a good place to sort of.
I think so. So right now, where we've come to is to say you have some growth of this early church as a movement that is growing out of Second Temple Judaism, but is now distinct from Judaism. You have this movement which is existing in this Greco-Roman world, but is also in a lot of ways very distinct from that Greco-Roman world, that has nevertheless managed to gain some followers, gain some converts.
Well, and form communities. They're very tight-knit, very committed to each other, very committed to their own prayers and their own hopes and their own dreams and their own ways of worship and liturgy, and are willing to die for these newfound beliefs and these newfound friends
Right.
and this newfound way of living.
Absolutely. It's also very much an urban movement
Sure.
at this point.
Yep.
That's important to point out,
That's
with a few
infrastructure-based.
exceptions. Exactly, that's
Yeah.
infrastructure-based. Urban areas are where ideas spread. Next time, I guess what we should pick up with, we'll talk about, on the one hand, how this community is beginning to organize itself.
Sure, structure.
Structure.
Gotta have
right?
ecclesiology.
Absolutely. And why those decisions are being made.
And
So-
how they're made.
Exactly, sort of in conversation with or in contradistinction to the Gnostics, for
Right.
example. And we'll also talk about some of the intellectual developments happening.
Sure.
So that's
The
where
great
we'll
thinkers of the period.
absolutely. That's where we'll go ahead and end for this time.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, absolutely,
Yay.
and we're looking forward to the next one.
So give us some feedback in the comments. We'd love to hear more about what you liked and what we can do, and we'll of course take questions. We'll answer questions
Absolutely.
at the beginning of the next section.
Yeah, and if there's any points that we've neglected to mention,
Right.
or anything that we got just absolutely wrong,
Or absolutely inspiringly right.
that's right. Let us know.
Steve, can you post PowerPoints too?
I think so.
Okay, we'll figure out if we can or not.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
bye.
Next time.